Hi class. In this lecture, I'm going to cover creating an HTML page to serve as a sort of portfolio for our projects throughout the semester. So it's not going to be like a regular portfolio with all different types of work, but we're going to design it in sort of the style of a portfolio, and we'll add works as we create them throughout the semester to this page. So we're going to be doing some review of HTML and CSS. And since this is the first lecture for the class, I will kind of go over some of the basic stuff about using the computer and the different software that we'll be using. But I will be creating more in-depth videos that go into specific pieces of software and different setups for both Mac and Windows. So if you're missing something with that, look for those videos and I'll link to them as well. I'm going to be working on the Mac operating system, as you can see from my desktop. I am going to be using Sublime Text as my text editor, and I'm going to be using Chrome as my browser. So you're welcome to use, obviously, if you're on Windows, you're going to be using Windows. If you prefer to use a different text editor like Atom or Brackets or VS Code or many others, that's perfectly okay. And even if you want to use another browser, I definitely recommend using Chrome because it'll be more similar to what I'll be doing the demos with. But if you prefer Safari or Firefox, that's also fine. So I'm just going to get started. I'm going to create a new project and get everything set up. And again, I'll be going through more basics in this video than I normally would, just since it's the first video that we're going to be watching. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So here's my desktop. I tend to put new projects on my desktop so I can easily access them. But you're welcome to put this folder wherever you like. It's just important that you know where the folder is and that you can access it. On the Mac, I'm just going to right click and create a new folder. You can also go to File and click New Folder here as well. Or you can hit Command-Shift-N and create a new folder. And you can see I've got some key commands turned on that you'll see in the bottom left corner. So if I use specific key combinations, it'll show that on the screen. So I'm going to hit enter and I'm going to rename this folder. So you can really call this whatever you want. I'm going to call this class portfolio. So I'm going to be using this as my class portfolio for this semester. Feel free to call it, named after the class or your name or anything else that you prefer. This is where all of our projects are going to live in this folder throughout the semester. So just making sure that you know which folder it is and what you're going to be using it for. So now that I've got my folder, I want to open it up in my text editor. So I have Sublime Text docked on my Mac over here. You might have your dock down at the bottom of the screen or somewhere else. So I can open up Sublime Text just by clicking on it and I'll get a new window. I can also go to the spotlight and just type in Sublime Text here and click open. But what we want to do is make sure that we have our folder open. So there's a couple ways to do that. I can drag the folder onto the icon like this, but I can also go to Sublime Text, go to File, go to Open, and then choose the folder. So I'm going to choose Class Portfolio and click Open. So then you will be able to see the class portfolio right here. So that way we know that we are in the right place. So that way we'll be sure that we're editing the right files and that when we create our server a little later, that we'll be creating it in the right place. So another thing I can do to increase the size of this window is just double click on the toolbar right there. So I'm going to increase the window size a bit. And then we can start editing our files. So I'll have another video that goes into more depth on how to set up Sublime Text on your computer. But just to quickly remind you that the text editor is where we actually write the code like the HTML and the CSS. And then we save those files and open the files in the browser where we actually view the result of those edits. I'm going to start creating my web page. So just as a reminder, this is an HTML and CSS review in this video. So I'm going to assume that you have some basic understanding of how HTML and how CSS works. I will link to resources if you want more review or if it's been a while since you've used these languages and you need to brush up a little bit. Don't worry about that. That's absolutely fine. But just so you understand, I am going to be kind of assuming that there's some basics that you know about HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and create my first file. So I'm going to hit Command N and make a new file. This works in Sublime Text. It may work in many of your other text editors as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this file right off the bat so that I don't have to, write a bunch of code and then accidentally not save it or something like that. So I'm going to hit Command S to save. And I'm going to go to my class portfolio folder and make sure I'm saving it in the right place. If you don't see this dropdown on the Mac, you might need to click right here. And then I'm going to the desktop and going to my folder. And I'm going to call this index.html. So if you've written HTML before, you know that the first page we always create is the index page. That's basically like a shorthand that browsers use to know where to load the main page for the site. So that's always going to be index.html. And so I'm going to go ahead and start editing. I'm going to increase my text size a little bit. So I'm going to start with the first HTML tag that we always start with, which is doctype HTML. And that's probably pretty small for a video. So I'm just going to increase that a bit to make sure that it's easier for you guys to see. You do not need to do that, obviously. You can leave the text the way you like it, or if you want to make it bigger, what I was doing is just hitting Command plus. You can also hit Command minus to make it smaller. The Command plus looks like Command equals in the key command because it's the same key. So that's my doc type HTML. I'm just basically telling the browser that this is an HTML type document, which makes it so the browser understands how to read it. Next, with HTML, I'm always going to start with my main tag. So remember, with HTML tags, we always start with these angle brackets, and we have the name of the tag inside. So this is HTML, and then we have the closing angle brackets. And that opens this sort of section of the document where we're going to be writing HTML. And then I can close the tag. I can either just type it out, or sometimes you can see that Sublime, as soon as I started to close the tag, Sublime kind of figured out that what I was trying to do. And some of your text editors will do that. They'll kind of write some code for you just to make things a little bit faster. So you may see that happen. If you see this message pop up with Sublime Text, just hit cancel. We don't need to purchase the software at this time. So I have my basic HTML node, and then everything's going to go inside of here. I always have two main parts of my HTML document: the head section, which contains some basic information, and then the body section, which contains the content that we actually see on the page. So I'm going to start with the head section, and then I'm going to create the body section. So again, I'm just kind of creating a new HTML tag and then closing that HTML tag. And you can see that these two tags, the head and the body, are enclosed inside the HTML tag. So that's one thing that you want to be careful, is that once we open this HTML tag and then open the head tag, we need to close this head tag before we close this HTML down here. So that's basically how the structure works, and it creates a hierarchy so that the browser understands where the different information that it will be looking for is in the page. So let's just start with the head section, and I'm going to add a few things in here. But in order to see these changes happen, I'm going to now open up my document in my browser. So I want to see the changes happening in the browser as I'm writing them, just to verify that I'm doing everything correctly up until this point. And so to do this, I'm going to use the Sublime Text Server. This is a plugin that you may or may not already have installed in your Sublime Text. If you do not have it installed, go ahead and look at the video in the description that will explain how to install it. So it's either going to be for Mac or Windows. There's two videos down in the description, so you can take a look at that now and then come back to this point. So moving on with the Sublime Text Server installed, I'm going to go to Tools, go to Sublime Server, and start Sublime Server. So once the Sublime Server is started, nothing actually happens, but we have to go over to the browser in order to see our local host. So I'm going to click on the Chrome window, and I'm going to go to New Incognito window. You can open up whatever you want, but for me, opening up an incognito window means that there's not going to be any of the other plugins that I use typically with Chrome, so you'll see a closer version to what's on your computer. So I'm going to open up this new Chrome window. And by default, when I start using the Sublime Server, the address I want to go to is localhost colon 8080, and I'll link that in the YouTube description as well. And so when I click here, you can see there's localhost 8080, and we can see we're in the Sublime server, and we can click on the class portfolio page, and that's going to take us to this blank page because we haven't added any content yet. But one thing I want to do before I go back is I want to open up the Chrome inspection tools. So hopefully you've seen this before. If you haven't, it's a good time to try to get used to this because we are going to be using it a lot this semester. So there's a couple ways that I can access this. One is to right click on the browser and click inspect, and that will open up my elements tab over here. If you see this box down here with the Chrome update, you can just X that out. We don't need that. And then you can kind of drag this up and down to see different amounts of these sections. So in the inspector, you see your HTML page up here, and then you see some of the styling rules down here, which we haven't added yet, but we will later on in the video. So another way to open this up is in the Chrome menu, going to View, and going to Developer, and then going to Inspect Elements. And then there's one more way if you want to use a shortcut, which is Command and Option and I, and that will open it up in the browser. So those are all specific to Chrome and the Mac. They may be a little bit different in Windows, and I'll include some instructions for using Windows as well. So we have our developer tools open, and so we can see that even though we haven't really created too much, that the HTML page that we've written in our text editor is the same as the one that we see in Chrome. And so our text editor is where we write the HTML, and then eventually we're going to publish it, and people are going to view it as a website in Chrome or another browser. So let's go back to Sublime Text. I can click on the Sublime Text icon to go back. Another thing that I use a lot, that you'll see me use a lot in these videos, is on the Mac, I can use Command Tab to move in between different applications on my computer. So if I hit Command Tab once, it'll go back to Chrome and then back to Sublime Text. And if I hold it, then I can choose all of these different applications that I have open. Okay, so let's get back to writing some HTML. The first thing that I'm almost always going to start with when I'm creating my HTML document in the head is the title of the page. And so I'm going to write the title tag here, and inside I'm going to say my class portfolio. So you can write whatever you want here. You can write my class portfolio, you can use the name of the class, or you can use your name. Whatever you want to put here is fine. What the title does is we don't actually see that on the HTML page, but you'll see when I reload up here, so let's zoom in a bit. When I reload this page, there's where you see the title in the browser bar up there in that tab. But the other thing that the title is useful for is, let's say you were Googling something. So let's say I wanted to Google a cat image, and I'm just going to click on the first website here. You can see that what that title gets used for is the name that you see in the Google results. Okay, so it's actually really important to have that title because otherwise you would just see some URL. And we can actually see that that's true. If I go to this website and then I hit Command Option U to view the source, I can look down here and there it is. There's the title. Okay, so we can see the title matches what we saw on Google, this cat pictures website. Another thing that the title is useful for is accessibility technologies. So they'll know where to look if you have a screen reader or something like that to read what the website is about. So it's important to use the standard HTML elements when creating your document. So let's go back. Another tag that I have to add is the meta character set. I won't go into too much depth here, but this basically is just a tag that every HTML page needs in order to be read and for the browser to know what characters, like alphabetic characters like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and numbers like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. It'll load those into memory as it's loading the website, so it won't have any errors. So that's actually all I'm going to add to the head section for now while we're just dealing with HTML. We'll return here in the later half of the video to do some CSS. Hopefully this is all feeling very much like review at this point. We're gonna go into the body section and start adding some actual content. The thing I'm gonna start with here, which is gonna allow me to do some design stuff later, is actually a container. So hopefully you've used a container in the past, but it's basically just an element that we put all of the other elements inside of so that we can do things like set the layout and the width of the page. So I'm gonna use a div for this. You've probably seen a div element before. It stands for division. It just is like a way of dividing an HTML page into separate parts. And then I'm going to use an ID. So you hopefully have seen the ID attribute as well. Basically what the ID says is it's giving this element a name, which is going to allow me to add styles to it later in CSS. So the ID for this section is the container. And then I'm going to close that div down here, and I'm going to put a couple different sections in it. So my page is just going to have two main sections. One is the header section, which will have the name of the site and some navigation. And then it'll have the portfolio section where I'll have links to my project. So I'm going to add a couple more divs now so that I can style that later. So I'm going to have div ID is the header section. Okay, so that's going to be the top part of my page where I'll have the name of the page and some links. And then I'm going to have my portfolio section, which is where my main portfolio content is going to be. And so these are all different IDs, which will allow me to add CSS styles later. One thing I should mention real quick that I forgot to mention before is that you'll see as I'm writing this code that there's some different colors associated with different types of content on the page. And with your text editor, it's probably going to look a little bit different, the colors that you see. The color scheme doesn't really matter. Sometimes if you have something wrong, like if I'm missing a tag here, you'll see that it kind of highlights this tag down here and it's saying there's an error there. So that might help you see that something's wrong, but the colors don't actually change the functionality. It's just a way to make it easier to look for certain things. Like if I want to look for IDs, it's highlighted pink so I know where I can see those IDs. So it just makes it a little bit easier to read the code, but if it looks different from mine, that's not a problem. So in my header section, I'm gonna have basically just the title of the page and then a couple of links to navigate in the page. So I'm gonna start with the name of the page and I'm gonna use an H1 for this. So hopefully you've seen an H1 before. It just stands for header 1. It's the most important header on the page. It is important to use these types of tags for a lot of reasons. One of them being accessibility. With a website, you want to indicate what type of content is inside the tags, because when a website is being read by a screen reader or being used by other accessibility devices, these labels like H1 kind of tell those devices what the most important parts of the page are or where the page is structured. So we've kind of agreed on these different standards for what a basic page layout is, and it makes it easier to follow those standards. So for my H1, I'm just going to call this my class portfolio, and I'm going to close the H1 at the end. So this actually, you can see, matches the title up here. It doesn't have to. This is just some content that we're going to see. But it often will match the title because it is the first thing that you're going to see on the page. So I have my H1. Let's take a look at that. So that's my first actual content. I'm going to increase the size of this a bit. Hopefully it'll be easier to see that. So here's my header, and then here's my H1. And we'll do some layout with that in the CSS section. So then after the H1, I'm going to make a list. And in the list, I'm just going to have a couple links to the home page and then the about page for my website. So I have an unordered list. That means there won't be numbers in front of it. So that's a UL. And then I'm going to have a list item. Okay, so that's one of my links in my list. And then I'm going to use an anchor tag. So hopefully you remember anchor tags. This is a hyperlink, so it's going to let us link between two different pages on the site. So these are just local links which link to a page that's in the same folder as our main page. So for the home link, I'm just going to use index.html, which is obviously this page. So, you know, we'll have a link to that when we duplicate the page. And then I'm going to close the anchor tag and close the list item. Then I'm going to make another list item, another anchor tag, and I'm just going to make an about page. This will be a page where you can add an image and a little description of yourself. And so I'm going to do the about page here, and then close the anchor and the list item. Okay, and then I'm going to close the unordered list here. So I'm going to save that and preview it. So here's my menu. Okay, so I have my class portfolio, that's the title, and here's the menu. If I click home, we're just on that page already. If we go to about, there is no about page yet, but we will create that shortly. Actually, let's do that right now, because it's not going to have a portfolio, so we're not going to need that section. So when I'm creating a new HTML page, rather than completely rewrite this whole section, the easier way to do it is just to duplicate the file and then make changes. So I'm going to go to the Finder and click New Finder window. And I'll go to the desktop. Here's my class portfolio. And I'm just going to hit Command D to duplicate that page. Another way I can do it is just to do duplicate from the context menu. Or I can do copy and paste. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But the quickest way is just Command D. And I'm going to rename this about.html. And the about page is basically the same thing. Okay, so if I open it up, it's the same thing. Instead of ID equals portfolio, I'm just going to say ID equals about. So we can style this differently if we need to. So I'm going to use a paragraph tag. And I'm going to say, hello, my name is Owen. Welcome to my class portfolio website. Okay, so I'm going to save that and then take a look. And so if I go to the About page, now we see this short description. And if I go back to home, then it's gone. So let's keep working on our index page, and we'll finish out the About page in a little bit. So I'm going to go back to index.html. So in my portfolio, I'm going to be adding new projects throughout the semester. Right now, I don't actually have any projects. So I'm just going to make some kind of like default projects. I'm going to have like a thumbnail and just a link to the project. And as we go through the semester, we'll add the real links in there. So inside the portfolio section, I'm going to create like an individual project, which will consist of a thumbnail and a link. And then I'm going to duplicate it. So even though we don't have these projects yet, at least I can work on the layout and design of the page. So I'm going to start with another div. And this one, instead of an ID, I'm going to use a class because we're going to have multiple projects throughout the semester. And so if I have multiple versions of something that I want to have the same style, I use a class instead of an ID. So I'm going to say class equals project. So each one of our projects will be contained in one of these divs, and it'll consist of an image. So I'm just going to do the image tag. And for the source, I'll fill that in a second. And I want some alternative text if the image doesn't load. So I'll say alt is thumbnail. And then I'm going to have another anchor tag. And I'm not going to fill these in right now because we haven't created these projects. So I'm just going to put a little hashtag there. We'll fill these in as we go through the semester. And I'm just going to put some default text, project number 1. I'm going to close that anchor tag. And so when we go back and load this page, we're going to see it just kind of looks like a broken project. And if we click on project 1, nothing happens. That's okay. It's just fill in for now. But we can see we have this class project here, and we have our image and our project. So you can see the text thumbnail here. That's what happens when you have a broken image. Hopefully your images won't be broken, but it's good to have that text there just in case they are, that people will know that, you know, this is what this was supposed to be. So let's grab an image real quick and throw it in there. So I'm going to go to Google. I'm just going to use a default project image. So maybe I'll just search for an image of something fun like a lizard. And I'll go to the image search. And when I'm adding images, I can use the tools to make sure that I can legally use the image on my site. So if I go to usage rights and click labeled for reuse, that way I know that, you know, the person who uploaded the image intended it to be used by anybody on the internet, so I won't be violating any copyright. So I'm going to click labeled for reuse. And I'm just going to find a nice image picture. So this one's from Wikipedia. That's always a good resource. They have a lot of images on the Wikipedia Commons. So this is a nice image. It has a lot of different sizes. I'm going to go with one that's a little bit on like kind of medium size, 640 pixels, because it is just going to be used as a thumbnail. So I don't need to use it to be big. And it's really just a placeholder for now. I don't really need this long term. So I'm gonna just drag this image onto my desktop. So I'll open up the Finder and close this a bit and then drag this in here. And I'm going to rename this image thumbnail because eventually I'm going to be replacing it and I won't need it anymore. So I'm just going to call that thumbnail.jpg, and then I'm going to fill that into the image source, src. So I'm going to say thumbnail.jpg. And since it's in the same folder, I can just reference the file name. I don't have to put a folder in there. So let's go back. Okay, so there's my image. And so I'm just going to make 3 of those just to kind of create a little bit more content so we can work on a layout, which we'll be doing in our CSS section. So I'm going to copy this whole section and I'm just going to paste it once, paste it twice. And I'll change the project to number 1, number 2, and number 3. And so when I go back to the project, now we have our image and our link. And so we have 3 projects. We'll get to lay this out in the next video. Okay, so the last thing that we have to do here, we're almost done with our HTML. Now I just have to go to the About page and finish this a bit. So one thing that I want on my About page is an image. Again, you can use an image of yourself, or if you want to use an image of something else, feel free. So what I'm going to do is go to the About page, and I'm going to add an image here, and I'm going to actually give the image CSS later, but for now I'm just going to add this image. So let's say this is going to be my portrait, and I'm just going to choose an image. It doesn't actually have to be you, but if you want to use an image of yourself, go for it. So I might just use a portrait of a lizard. So I'm just going to use this other lizard image since I already have this open. And I'll use a medium-sized one again, and I'll drag this onto my page again. So I'm going to call that portrait.jpg. And so then I'm going to fill in the source here, portrait.jpg. Okay, I'll add some CSS to this later. And so to do that, I'm just going to put an ID here. I'm going to say the ID is portrait. So that way I can add some CSS in the next video. So that is our basic HTML overview. I'm going to add some links in here to some other tutorials and things like that in the description of the video, so that if you do want to, kind of brush up on your HTML a bit more, you can do that. But in this class, we're actually not going to be that focused on HTML and CSS. So this is just kind of a bit of a review to get our page set up. And then in most of our classes, we'll be kind of talking about other subjects with JavaScript. And so I'm going to stop this video here. In the next video, we'll be adding CSS to this page to make it look like, a real portfolio.